My name is Leslie Hendrickson. I am on the steering committee of the Newburyport Literary Festival, and welcome to the 18th edition of this festival. Thanks for being here. This is our first hybrid festival. We had our first in-person day in Newburyport, which is on the North Shore of Massachusetts, if you don't know. We had that yesterday, and it was great. It was our first time being back since the pandemic, and it was really wonderful to have our venues full of people again. So thanks to everyone who made that possible, to all the volunteers and authors. And now we are returning for a full day of online programming, which we're well into and have had a great day. A couple of things I want to tell you. I also want to thank some of our sponsors, including the Institute for Savings and the Newburyport Bank. They've made this event possible since the beginning, and we so appreciate it. We have also received funding from the Massachusetts Cultural Council, as well as local council chapters in Newburyport, Newbury, West Newbury, Georgetown, Raleigh, and Salisbury. Thank you. The Yellow School was a huge supporter of the festival this year, as was the Mass Center for the Book. Thank you both as well. We also want to support our independent bookstore partners. That includes the Bookshop of Beverly Farms, which Hannah co-owns, and Jabberwocky Bookshop here in Newburyport. Please check them out. You can find all the books we're talking about and all the books from the festival through those bookstores, and we hope you're supporting your independent bookstores elsewhere if you can't make it to those. I want to introduce our speakers. Allegra Goodman, her novels include The Chalk Artist, Intuition, The Cookbook Collector, Paradise Park, and Caterskill Falls. Caterskill Falls, excuse me, a National Book Award finalist. Her fiction has appeared in the New Yorker, Commentary, and Plowshares, and has been anthologized in the O. Henry Awards and Best American Short Stories. Kai Harris is a writer and educator from Detroit, Michigan, who uses her voice to uplift the Black community through realistic fiction centered on the Black experience. She resides in the Bay Area with her husband, 3 daughters, and dog Tabasco, where she is an assistant professor of creative writing at Santa Clara University. Jessica Anya Blau is the author of 5 novels, the latest of which is the best-selling Mary Jane. She also ghostwrites, and she wrote the screenplay for Mary Jane, which is being produced by Sony 3000 Pictures. She lives in New York City. And Hannah Harlow has an MFA in fiction from the Bennington Writing Seminars. After working in publishing for 17 years, most recently at Houghton Mifflin Harcourt as Executive Director of Marketing, she left in January 2020 to purchase the Bookshop of Beverly Farms in Beverly, Massachusetts. She lives on the North Shore with her husband and 2 boys, and she is also a member of the programming committee for the Newburyport Literary Festival. So she and I have worked together on this project, and I am going to leave it to her. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. Thanks for all the hard work that Leslie's been doing all day today, all day yesterday, and in the months leading up to this. It's been hours and hours of her time, and we really appreciate it. It's been an amazing weekend. I'm thrilled to be here. Whether it's your first event of the weekend or your 20th, welcome to everybody to the session. It's going to be a great discussion about coming of age novels. And I want to say, if you haven't read these books that we're going to talk about, I love all of them. I'm thrilled to be here talking about them, and you are going to want to read them by the end of this session. So please use the links to buy from either my bookstore or Jabberwocky or your local independent. We also love libraries, so you can also, request these books from your local library. That's all wonderful. So we have 3 very different books to talk about, but they all have at least one thing in common, and that is, I would describe them as coming of age stories. So I want to start just by hearing about what each of the books are about and having each of our authors kind of introduce their stories to us. So Jessica, let's start with you.
Okay. So Mary Jane, well, the idea came to me. I was at a party in New York City, and I met this woman who had been a summer nanny for a psychiatrist in the middle of the 70s. And the psychiatrist was hiding on his 3rd floor, a rock star and a movie star, and the rock star was getting sober. And it was the most amazing story to me. And so I asked her all these questions, and of course, she couldn't remember anything, and she didn't interact with them, and she had no interest in them. And she was like, they were just in the house. And, and of course I was like, did you go through her clothes? And she's like, no. And then I felt like a horrible person because of course I would have looked at her clothes. And I was like, what did they eat? And she's like, I don't remember. I mean, she just didn't, all she had was this, and it just kind of killed me. It seemed like that would have been my dream summer. So around the same time, I was ghostwriting for a celebrity, and we had read all her diaries one night in this dramatic reading, and she was really smart and a great writer. And at the end of the reading, I said, you should just publish these diaries, like edit them and publish them. And then 2 days later, I was fired. And so I was fired. I lost a job. I didn't have any income. I was getting divorced. My life was falling apart. And I thought, I'm just going to enter my fantasy life of that summer nanny job. And I sat down and I wrote Mary Jane about a summer nanny who is working for a psychiatrist who's hiding a rock star and a movie star on the 3rd floor of his house. And I put it in Baltimore because I'd lived there and it just seemed like a good place. So that's the story.
Awesome. Thank you. And Kai, what about you?
Okay, so my novel it's called What the Fireflies Knew, and it's actually my debut novel. So I'm hearing that both of you have written a lot of books, which is exciting because I am hoping to do the same as time goes on. But this novel was written. It started out as coming from some of my own experiences, but then I created a character and a plot to basically fit into a setting that I was really familiar with. So I spent summers growing up with my grandfather in Lansing and wanted to dream up a character in a situation that would be interesting to describe there. And so the story is about a young girl named KB who is 10 going on 11. And the book begins when she finds her father has passed away from a drug overdose. And so the story begins with that trauma, but focuses on that summer that her and her older sister spend with their grandfather, who they don't really know. They've only met, one time. Their mom leaves them there though. And KB is kind of forced to figure everything out. She's trying to get her big sister's attention, to get her to want to play with her again. And she's trying to get through kind of the grumpy exterior of her granddaddy. And, she's trying to make friends and she loves to catch bugs. And, she's kind of just a regular kid who's navigating some really big life situations. And the book is just the story of that summer that they spent together in.
She loved to catch bugs. I love that.
Yeah.
And Allegra, you of course have written many books, but tell us about Sam.
So Sam was inspired by my daughter. I have 4 children. My daughter's the youngest. Our 3 sons were kind of like pretty well-behaved boys who like to read. They're very academic. And then we had a really rambunctious child, our little girl, who was like literally climbing the walls of our house all the time, declared that she hated books, was very, very active, was very energetic. And I started thinking about girlhood and the energy that little girls have. And also what can happen to that energy as they get older, when doubt creeps in, when they experience disappointment, when our sick culture starts getting its tentacles into them, and how they might withstand that or grow through it. So that's where my character Sam came from. It's a young girl growing up in Beverly on the North Shore of Massachusetts.
Awesome. And we're going to get back to girlhood really quickly, but I feel like maybe we should start by defining what a coming of age novel is, or what it at least means to us. What are some qualities you think of when you think of a coming of age novel? I mean, I think maybe it's a little bit obvious, but maybe you guys could each talk about, what it means to you. Allegra, how about we go back to you?
Well, I think a coming of age novel has to do with somebody growing up. And I would also add to that would be a very broad definition, but most coming of age novels, the young person is tested in some way, spiritually, emotionally, physically, tested, that, they have to overcome something or overcome things to grow up. And those things that they overcome could come from many sources: problems in their family, societal pressures, racism, poverty. It could be a lot of things, or just like, and it can also be those small indignities that children experience, just how mean other kids are. All of, it could come from many sources. So I think there's sort of an overcoming that might happen in a coming of age story.
Nice. Yeah, Jessica, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. I also think it's the time when you realize that your family of origin, whatever that family is that there's a world outside of that, and that the family you know, and the meals you know, and the music you know, and the rituals you know, and whatever it is, religion or no religion, that isn't the entire world. So it's sort of discovering that the world is bigger than what you know, and either latching onto ideas and redefining yourselves, or rejecting them, or identifying yourself with the things you discover, like new music and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, that like very classically describes your book, which I love how Mary Jane, when she meets the Cohn family who she's nannying for the summer, it's just all these new ideas, and she realizes that she's been kind of sheltered by her family.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like traveling. You realize, oh, we're all different, but we're all alike. Like you find the thing that makes you exactly like everybody else in the world, but then you also see the greatness in the differences.
Kai, did you want to add anything about?
I mean, what you all have said is wonderful. I love the point you were making, Jessica, about deciding kind of like who you're going to be in the midst of everything that you're learning about the world around you and everyone else, and you're learning about yourself, and you're kind of deciding, how do I fit into this? And I think for me, as a college professor, I'm always thinking about coming of age from both the perspective of like writing it, but also thinking about teaching it, thinking about my students and how they're experiencing coming of age when they show up on a college campus, and, kind of for the first time get to figure out like, who am I, who do I want to be? Who am I, how am I going to show up? And I also teach a lot about, and Allegra, you kind of alluded to this, just the ways that coming of age is different for different types of writers and different types of books. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about how the coming of age stories of girls and women are distinctly different, types of coming of age stories, because there are things that girls and women will experience to come of age that are different, right, than them kind of white male centered coming of age stories that started this, tradition, I guess, in the beginning. And also thinking about how Black writers have taken the genre and done different things with it to accommodate for the types of things that Black, youth will experience in a typical kind of coming of age moment. So yeah, I agree with everything. And I think just I'm very interested in the nuances of how our identity impacts that coming of age journey.
Yeah, Kai, maybe you could talk a little about that. Like, do you have any specific examples about what it is about girlhood? What it is about Black girlhood? Yeah, what in anything you wanted to say with your book about that experience?
Yeah, I think that this book is, specifically to me, a Black girlhood story, and thinking about like what makes that experience unique. And I really wanted to put Black girlhood on the page as it is. So my perspective is, there's a first person narrator. It's present tense. It's very immediate. It's very in her mind. So the reader doesn't know anything that KB doesn't know, and doesn't know anything before she knows it. And so in that way, I wanted to kind of put my reader into that experience of just like walking in her shoes. What does it, what do things look like through her vantage point? Like, what does this thing smell like? And what would she notice in this moment when she kind of walks into this space? What would stand out to her? And so, as I was doing it, I didn't think about what I was doing as I was doing it. But afterwards, I felt like, wow, this is really a pretty, I felt like it was a pretty authentic portrayal of Black girlhood, in that there is some of the extremes, right? Some of the trauma and grief that the character is experiencing. But also there's just like really super regular stuff, like her learning how to cook dishes that, people in her family have been cooking for years, and her playing cards games with her family members, or, getting in fights with her big sister. And, a lot of those things were just like the little things that I felt like made up my own childhood, but I've also heard from other people like, wow, this feels very familiar, right? And that doesn't even have to be people who've experienced Black girlhood specifically. So I think it's also been beautiful to see how Black girlhood as a category can also be very universal and feel very familiar to people who have had other types of, growing up and coming of age experience.
Yeah, definitely. And Allegra, you had, when you were saying about there are tests kind of in the coming of age novel, And I wanted to ask about Sam and that the girlhood experience you were capturing, because your novel kind of spans the longest length of time. Like we're with Sam for many years. In Jessica and Kai's books, it's both set over the course of a summer. So can you talk a little about some of the things, because there were kind of many things where that Sam gets kind of tested and
Yeah, so my book starts, she's 7 years old, and it ends, I mean, she's still young when it ends, but she's like more like 20. So she'd be more like Kai's students coming, starting, embarking on her education in a way. And so she goes through, the teenage years, and she, well, one of her biggest tests is that she's very disappointed in her father, who's sort of a magical but problematic man. And she is tested by her relationships with other men, with, first boyfriend, with, inappropriate relationship, with finding somebody who seems a little bit, like just trying to figure stuff out. And it's that kind of testing is throughout the book as she's growing. And as Jessica said, she's also realizing that there's this world beyond her family and beyond her own circumstances. And the book sort of charts the opening of her mind and her heart as she grows. And for me, that's actually the most interesting part of the coming of age story, is just sort of watching that development of a human being, somebody becoming human. Seeing a mother and a father, not as just mother and father, but as people, as humans who are flawed and have troubles just like everybody else, getting and learning and getting perspective as she gets older on what she's done, viewing something differently than she had when she was younger. All of those things are tests and challenges and also opportunities.
Yeah. And Jessica, how about you? Was there anything specific you wanted to say about girlhood? And we can get in, I was going to save this for later, but we can start talking about sex now. I mean, I feel like we can't talk about a coming of age novel, and especially in girlhood, without talking about sex and their relationships with men. And even though there's not a lot of sex happening in your book, Jessica, I don't know, we can dive into that too.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's interesting. We all wrote all of our novels are in first person.
Not me.
So I love this. Allegra and I talked about this.
It's totally fine. I actually am really flattered when people say that to me, because it's in the third person, but it's a very close third person. And I even had a reviewer say that it was a first person novel. And I was like, oh.
I think I read it. By the way, I bought it and read it like the day it came out. And so in my head,
no, please don't be embarrassed.
I think of her voice in it. Like I think of her voice is so clear in it.
It's just a very intimate third person
close. Yeah.
Yeah.
But so no, I think a lot of it too is seeing your parents in a different light, as happens with Sam with their father, and is part of it is like you sort of have faith in your parents as God, or you don't. But it's like that's also part of the shift. But I'm happy to talk about sex or no sex or whatever. Wherever you want to go is fine by me.
Yeah, let's talk about sex. I mean, Mary Jane, for much of the book, thinks she's a sex addict. But I mean, I feel like that's part of the awakening for a woman. It's just realizing that sex exists, maybe.
Right. Yeah. And that in her own house, sex is so hidden and forbidden. I mean, it's so not seen and doesn't exist, like affection and love. Not that sex and affection are the exact same thing, but none of that exists. So suddenly she goes to this house where people hug and they kiss and they say, I love you. And I wasn't trying to make one house better or worse. I was just trying to turn a camera on the two houses that were existing simultaneously for her. But the other house, there's so much open sexuality that suddenly sex, and it was 1975 in the book, that suddenly sex is just coming at her everywhere. And because it's coming at her, it's like she's riveted by it, like she hasn't really been exposed to it. So she's riveted by it. And then in not being exposed to it and nobody talking about it and it never coming up, these overwhelming normal feelings feel like she's, she thinks something's wrong with her. By the way, I have to point out that the director of the movie bought us each first edition Joy of Sex that is sitting on my
oh my God.
And I won't flip it open because the pictures are amazing, but it's just like the most amazing thing. But I realized that the doorman in my building put packages in for me when I'm gone. And I just realized that the book is out like on the counter. And I just like, I'm just having this moment of embarrassment and shame about sex. So
it's research.
Yeah.
What are you embarrassed for?
Yes. So
But that's what I love about Mary Jane. It's like there's a lot of joy and a lot of like normalizing these feelings and normalizing things like mental health. And like the Mr. Cohn, Dr. Cohn, who's a psychiatrist or therapist, at the
right.
end, he's like, why do you think you're a sex addict? Are you engaged in a lot of sex? And she's just like, no.
Well,
But
just psychiatry. I mean, when I was growing up, so we grew up, so Mary Jane, she's the neighborhood, Roland Park, actually exists, and they actually didn't let Jews in the neighborhood until the mid-70s. So in real life and in the book, the Cohns are the first Jewish family in the neighborhood. And when I was growing up, we were the only Jews in our neighborhood also. And we were the only people I knew who went to therapy. My dad went to therapy all the time. My mom went to therapy. My sister went to therapy, went to family therapy. I mean, it was just like there, and nobody else went to it and nobody else would talk about it. So there was also, I mean, it was almost like seeing a psychiatrist was as, forbidden as having sex. Like all these things were so hidden and repressed. And suddenly she goes in this house where there's therapy and sex and the joy of sex. And
Jessica, one thing that I really loved about your book, though, is that it's not like she goes and discovers this whole new wonderful world and falls in love with it and completely rejects where she came from, but that she brings from her own family some things that they really appreciate, like organization and meal prep and,
yeah,
and
she
like
loves the
cleaning
food.
up after yourself and like stuff that her mom does, which, and they're like, wow, you're a miracle, and so it's just like, it's not just a simple clash of cultures, but she's like contributing.
Right.
I
Yeah.
love that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I wasn't trying to make one world better or worse. I was just actually sort of turning on a camera. And in the Cohn house, I was actually seeing my childhood house. And then when she went home, I was seeing my best friend's house, but she had wonderful parents, but her house was that organized. And I wanted an organized house so badly, a refrigerator that had a light on in it. Like our fridge never had a light, and I didn't realize you could just change a light bulb and you'd have a fridge light until I was like 30 years old. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. So there was a lot of just me playing out my life and what I felt like were things I wanted and needed in reverse.
yeah, well, let's go back to we talked about the first person narrations a little bit. We touched on that, but I want to go back to, I think, is a common question people have when we talk about novels that are narrated by young people, in this case, all young women. What is that line between a book about like what makes it for kids and what makes it for adults? And your books are all clearly for adults. And actually, Kai, I want to start with you because you have an author's note at the beginning of your novel. And there's a line in there that says, "What the Fireflies Knew is a story of Black girlhood that, while told from the perspective of a child, is intended for adult readers." So you kind of lay it out there. This is not for a younger audience. What do you see as like what made it for adults versus for younger readers?
This is it's been such a complicated journey, right? Because when I first wrote the book, that was a big part of my project, was that I was writing something from the perspective of a young person, but it was intended for adult readers. The main difference to me was how I was writing it, what I was including. There are some things in the book that are pretty heavy, and it's not that young people can't read those things, but I think one thing that I really wanted to do is also to show adults the importance of youth voice and hearing this story kind of told from the perspective of a kid and having to pay attention to it. So that was a big part of like my project and what I was aiming to do. What's interesting, a couple things are interesting. So that author's note only exists in the paperback, which just came out this year in February. The hardcover came out a year before that, so last year in February. So when the hardcover came out, I discovered that a lot of people thought it was a kid's book. And so, we had worked really hard to try to make it clear that it was not a book for kids. It feels like a very complicated thing to do because my character is 10 years old. And I was, shortly after the book came out, I'm just like seeing people post on social media, even people who are trying to promote the book, and they're labeling it as middle grade or, young adult. The middle grade was especially concerning to me because while I have decided that young adult is fine, I'm like, please don't let your 10-year-olds read this book alone, right? And so when I have people come to my readings and they say, I'm buying this for my child, I'll say, like, how old is your child? And if they say 10, then I'll say, okay, well, just so you know, this book is not intended for that age group. If you'd like your 10-year-old to read the book, I would suggest reading it with them so that you all can discuss together some of the heavier topics as they arise, because I do think the book lends itself well to being a discussion book, a discussion piece for families, for in schools. And so now, things have shifted such that I think we have like officially crossed over where it's also being listed as young adult, all the way to the point where like my publisher is leaning into it as both adult and young adult. I've been doing high school visits at this point. There are high schools who have assigned this book as a part of their curriculum, which is really, amazing. And that's something that I imagined would happen, especially because I thought it was a book for adults. But I think that some of the young adult readers that I've spoken to about this book have taken things from the book that were even different than what I had in mind when I was thinking I was writing it for adults. So I can appreciate that the book can lend itself to both of those experiences. So, I think it's just, it honestly had more to do with what my intentions were, which was to point out, my narrator is a character who's demanding attention, and she's like the youngest person in her family, but she has a really big impact. She's like trying to fix everybody and fix everything. And the ways that she sees the world and thinks about the world are actually the thing that kind of helps the family heal and helps the family come to understand things. So I think a big part of what I was trying to do with the project was to show that we should be listening to the young folks in our lives because they have lots of important things to say. A lot of times they understand and see things in different ways than we do, in better ways than we do, and have a lot to offer to the conversation. And that came from me remembering being a young person and feeling like there were things going on around me that I didn't get to have a say on, although they directly impacted me, right? Like trauma that I experienced as a child, for example, that I couldn't get anyone to process with me because I didn't get to grow up going to therapy. And not only that, but if I tried to ask questions about big things going on, I'd be told to mind my business or to stay in a kid's place or, be seen and not heard. And so, that was a rough experience because there was a lot going on that I needed to process, that I needed answers on, and that maybe I would have been able to like offer something useful if anyone would have asked my opinion on things that were going on in my life that were affecting me too. So, I wanted it to just be kind of a book told from the perspective of a kid, written for adults. Now it's crossed over into YA, which I think is beautiful and is a whole new, giving the book like a whole new life and existence. But, if anything younger than that, I would say it needs to be a buddy read if you're gonna, have your younger readers interact with this.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, having read a lot of YA, I know a lot of really bonkers stuff happens in those books.
Yeah.
So I can see how it could be read as a YA book.
Yeah.
But I mean, KB kind of experiences some pretty troubling things. But
Right.
what I really appreciate about your narration is that she's, you're writing in this 10-year-old, she turns 11 in the book, in that voice. It's very convincing. And I know, and she's wise, but she's never like, so wise beyond her years that it's kind of unbelievable. So I thought you did a really good job with that, because sometimes those young narrators, you're like, that they're a little too smart.
Yeah, thank you. You definitely have to find the sweet spot.
Yeah. Allegra, what about you? Was there ever any question in your mind about who this book was for, or?
I always thought of it as a book for adults, partly because it's a book about parenting as well as about being a child, and Sam's parents are such important characters in it. We see everybody only through Sam's eyes, but the reader sees more and can put more together. And I always pictured that adult reader, and I always felt like also it was the kind of book that I needed to be an adult to write very much and have the experience of being a parent to write. But I worried because she was so young when the book starts. She's 7. And I thought it might be pigeonholed as a young adult book, which I didn't see it as. And my editor never saw it that way and always looked at it as an adult book. I do think these are questions more of marketing than of writing. And there's a lot of overlap. I know tons of adults who love young adult fiction, so-called young adult fiction. And of course, there are lots of young people who read very sophisticated stuff. So, there's all that overlap. And so like if my book was read by people in high school, I'd be thrilled, it's all good, you know.
Yeah. I think about this all the time. People come into the bookstore, young readers, and I have teens who want to read from the adult section, and I have to think really hard about, what's appropriate. And some of the younger readers who want to start reading YA, and I know there's a lot of, like I said, crazy stuff that happens. But, I obviously always feel like kids should read whatever they want to read, and they will self-select, I think. But I think, like Jessica, I think Mary Jane was totally appropriate for teen readers. But again, was there ever any question in your mind about who you were writing for, or, what makes a book for adults versus for younger readers?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Allegra. It's always the marketing people. I was writing a book and I wasn't thinking of it as YA, and it came out as not YA, but then it would make these YA lists, and which was fine with me.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I mean, when I think about my favorite coming of age novels, there are certainly those in the YA category. Like The Hate You Give, I love that book. The Outsiders. And then in like the adult side, I think of Sing Unburied Sing by Jessamine Ward and We the Animals by Justin Torres. So I wonder if you can all give us maybe a couple favorites or one favorite or anything that inspired you while you were writing your book. But and also, while you guys think of your answers, I would say to all of our audience members, we'd love to hear what your favorite coming of age novels are too. If you want to throw those in the chat, as though our TBR piles aren't big enough, they can always be bigger. So tell us what you think we should read. Jessica, why don't you start us off?
Well, I've told Allegra before we were in here, but I've been a huge fan of Allegra Goodman for years, everything. So, and I read very broadly. The only thing I don't read is like fantasy and sci-fi, but I do like coming of age novels, and I mean, I can't really, you named a couple of Outsiders, and I would always read what my kids were reading. One of them kept reading Fault in Our Stars, and I read that, and it was great. I mean, and everything Judy Blume ever wrote is amazing. And there's so many great writers. If I think of I remember Rule of the Bone by Russell Banks. So that was like a great kind of coming of age with a boy in it that was sort of interesting.
Kai, how about you?
Yeah, you mentioned Sing Unburied Sing. Jessamine Ward is one of my favorite authors of all time. And her book, Salvage the Bones, is a coming of age story that is my favorite book and was a huge inspiration when I was writing Fireflies. So that's one of my tops. I love Jacqueline Woodson, her coming of age work. Honestly, probably The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, which is, a very difficult read for sure. But when Fireflies came out, there were people who were mentioning my book alongside that book, and it blew my mind. And, this past quarter, my students and I read The Bluest Eye together. And it was, I have read it multiple times, but it was the first time I've read it since I wrote a book. And I realized that there are a lot of commonalities that I wasn't, necessarily thinking about. But Toni Morrison's probably my greatest literary influence. So I think it's just in me at this point. But I think it's just like a masterclass on just like, writing human psychology. I appreciate in that book how Toni Morrison gave everyone space to have a story and to understand that like all of us have our own coming of age journey, right? That she highlighted that for each of these adult characters, at some point they were young and they were coming of age, and here are the things that happened to them that led them to become these types of adults, which I think is just a beautiful, beautiful way of thinking about it. So those are some of my favorites.
How about you, Allegra?
I was also going to mention Salvage the Bones. So it's one of my favorite books. And I think also there's a huge connection between Toni Morrison and Jessamine Ward. In terms of, there's just like, you can just draw a line. I mean, Jessamine Ward's her own writer, but she's informed by Toni Morrison.
Yeah,
I also
definitely
really like
continuing that tradition.
Yeah,
for
in
sure.
that tradition. Exactly. But she's just, I love the writing in Salvage the Bones. And that's a good example of a book that is about a young person that you might think is a YA, but it has that is very much an adult book in terms of its complexity. And I also like, another classic, This Boy's Life by Tobias Wolff is a great one. And And then when I was a kid, like to go back in time, like really old fashioned, like something like Little Women is actually a really interesting kind of coming of age of 4 different young women, young girls who become women. There's just a great tradition. And if this is a genre, there's a great tradition of it
Right.
in all cultures
I
and times.
capture the castle. I mean, there's so many things like, yeah, there's I mean, I guess coming of age books are really kind of great because when you start to think of them, you can think of so many great ones.
Yeah.
Definitely. There's some great ones in the chat too. Someone said Firekeeper's Daughter, which is one of my favorites. But I think it's
I saw someone.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I saw someone mention their eyes were watching God. And it reminded me that like a thing that I was doing too was like I put reference to other books in my book, and Their Eyes Are Watching God was one of them. And then also Anne of Green Gables, which was my favorite book when I was growing up. And so I think a lot of the books that I put in my book, not even realizing it, but a lot of them were coming of age stories. And I was just using them as stories that my character was really relating to in that moment of her life. And it made sense that those were the kinds of stories she was, finding really resonant at that point.
Yeah, I was going to ask about, the books that you mentioned in your book, Kai. I guess you mentioned most of them. There was maybe one other one. But how I thought it was so interesting that Anne of Green Gables, I mean, hearing it was one of your favorites and it was one of KB's, but then you talk about how representation really matters and she kind of discovers when their eyes were watching God. Can you talk a little bit about that as, what it means for young women?
Yeah, I didn't have any plan to include references to books in my novel. It just sort of happened because KB was in a car on a long car ride, and I was like, what would she be doing? And I'm like, well, she's probably reading a book, because I knew I was going to make her be a bookworm because I was a bookworm. And it felt like, I didn't give her all of my personality, but that felt like one thing I thought we would have in common. And so I needed to give her a book. And at that point, I just picked Anne of Green Gables because it had been my favorite. So I had no other reasoning but beyond that. And then at some point as I was writing, I went back and reread parts of Anne of Green Gables because I was like, well, what would KB be thinking about what she's reading right now? Like, what would be standing out to her? And then I realized how many parallels she would have been able to find in thinking about, that character. And I remember when I was reading Anne of Green Gables, I felt like me and Anne were like the exact same person. Like, I was just like, we are the same. There is nothing different about us. Obviously, there are lots of things that are different about us, but I didn't feel that at all. I just felt like, here's somebody who gets me, like we are in the same boat completely. And so I wanted KB to have that feeling, but also she starts to have new feelings when she's at Granddaddy's house and she starts reading fiction with Black characters, because that's the first time that's happened for her. So she reads Their Eyes Are Watching God because, she's at this point, she's having to pick books off of Granddaddy's bookshelf and he only has adult books. So she picks that book up. And the good thing is at the beginning, the character's younger. So she's able to kind of feel like this feels familiar. And then as the character grows up, she sees parts of herself, parts of her older sister, Nia, and parts of her mom in this character. And it helps her to understand all of them a bit better. And so that's, and the language, she feels very comfortable with the people in that story and the way that they speak. And she realizes that, books can be, can make her feel at home in different ways, right? And so then by the end of my novel, she's gifted a book that is of a character who shares a, similar identity as her. And as she reads that book, she discovers another thing, like there are little girls just like me, and we can be the main character of a book, right? And I don't have to change who I am to be good or to be important or to have a story or, identity or perspective that matters. So I definitely wanted to showcase that. And I think that I wanted to show that all of those things are important, right? Anne of Green Gables is so important to KB. It's her best book. And I don't want to take away from that at all. I had that same experience growing up, that I loved reading books about other, other types of perspectives and other types of lived experiences, because I learned so much and I developed such a great empathy for other people. But also for me, I didn't read a book with, Black main characters until I was much older. And if I did, they were enslaved people, or they were incarcerated, or they were in, some kind of situation that didn't feel similar to my life, And so I was like, where are the books that are just about like regular Black girls doing regular things, And that's a journey that KB is on as well. And so I wanted to try to give her some books along the way to show her, how all of these elements are important when we're picking books for ourselves and for our youth.
That's awesome. And Mary Jane, the media is more music.
Yeah.
How do you feel the music affected Mary Jane's journey? And
Yeah, I mean, I think music is, I mean, if like when I was growing up in the neighborhood we were the only people who had rock and roll records, and they were all bought by my mother, and there was a turntable and speakers, and we'd come to my house and we'd put them on, and it was like a lot of the records that are in the book. And but I think music as a coming of age, people start defining themselves, like I'm somebody who likes punk, or I like rock and roll, or I'm a heavy metal person, or I like funk, or I like, so it was just sort of this, it's a way of sort of figuring out who you are. Often is you like that, I like that, we're alike, is music. But also in the 70s, I think the 70s is the decade for the best music, because it's when there's funk, there's rock and roll, there's singer-songwriter, and there's disco. I mean, it's like all merging together in one time. You have Glenn Campbell and you have Sly and the Family Stone all at once, and they're both amazing. So I think for me, I was listening to 70s music the whole time I was writing, but it was her way of finding a new identity, identifying yourself by what you like.
And I think for Sam, that was sort of rock climbing, right? Like figuring out what you like.
I have the character who is not very bookish. She doesn't like to read. And I would say that her experience of literature and storytelling is all through her father. It's sort of mediated through her father. So she's not bookish, but he tells her the story of the Lord of the Rings, and he makes a map with her of like all these fancy places, because he has that gift. And when she's little, he teaches her about poetry and about metaphors, but she doesn't like to read. So her best friend is the reader, who would have read Anne of Green Gables and all these books. And, she's always trying to push these books on Sam, and Sam's like, oh my God, it's so long. And she says, she's reading this book about this orphan who goes to this horrible school and everybody's really cold. And then her friend dies in her bed, and like, no, which is Jane Eyre. So I enjoyed sort of writing about the girl who has to find some other way to figure out how she fits in the world. And for her, it's physical. And she's a boulderer. She's got to find her handholds and her footholds and figure out how to, as they say in bouldering, solve the problem of getting up to the top.
I spent last Sunday at Metro Rock in Newburyport for a kid's birthday party, and I thought of you.
Did you climb?
I did not climb. I watched small children climb. And they're so good at it. It's awesome.
Yes.
So you just mentioned Sam's father. So sorry, I want to pause and say, if anyone has questions, you should start throwing them in the Q&A, because we have about 15 minutes left, I think. So if you have questions you want answered, let me know. In the meantime, I want to talk about secondary characters, because I think no one really comes of age on their own. Let's see, where should we start? I guess, Kai, we'll go back to you. So this is set over the course of a summer. KB goes to Lansing to live with her grandfather, and she doesn't really know her grandfather that well, and she and her sister are there for the summer. And while KB's parents are really present, they're on the, in spirit, they're not there that summer. And I always, you kind of go into it being like, okay, the grandfather is definitely going to be a force for good. This is going to be a great relationship. But her sister Nia is also there. And that's like, that relationship gets really dicey. So I wonder if you can just talk about, those two main characters that KB is playing off of.
Yeah, it's interesting because, KB kind of finds herself in this situation with these two people who at the beginning of the novel are not really interacting with her, giving her much to work with. What KB doesn't understand yet is that a lot of the things that her sister is, a lot of the ways that her sister is kind of showing up in this moment, it has to do with not just the grief and the trauma from what's happened with their father, but also her coming of age journey and where she is in terms of, adolescence. And she's 14 going on 15, which is a very different time, right, than 10 going on 11. And she has other interests and things that are becoming pressing to her, such as her friendships, like growing attraction to boys and wanting to explore sexuality in some different smaller ways. And so KB is having a difficult time because Nia has always been her person. They've been very close and they've been kind of navigating trauma together for a long time, even if KB didn't, recognize it as such. Nia recognized it a bit more than KB because she's older and she's able to understand what's going on when their parents are fighting and understand what daddy's doing that's wrong and how it's harmful. And she even has a moment where she does let KB know about something that happened while daddy was still alive that was traumatic for her. So they're kind of in different places, and all of them are, Mama and KB and Nia are all experiencing trauma, and they're all grieving a loss, and they're all doing it in completely different ways. So I think with the secondary characters, I just wanted to try to figure out how to show bits and pieces of their process, their grieving process, and their healing process, but as seen through KB's eyes, so what she understands of it. So we'll see KB point out that Nia is withdrawing, for example, but she doesn't know that that's what that is. And so she just kind of describes it as she sees it. Also, KB has, a bad habit of doing whatever her big sister does. And she's always done that. And so now she's trying to do what her big sister does, even in moments where it kind of gets her in trouble, right? So there's that dynamic. The relationship with Granddaddy was very fun for me to write because I based that character off of my own grandfather who passed away when I was probably about, 15 or 16 or something like that. But the last time I would have spent a summer with him in Lansing would have been around the age that KB is in this story. So it was almost my way of just like writing a glimpse of us, except me and him had a very different relationship and I knew him very well. But I wanted to like re-envision, and one of you said something similar to this. I think it was you, Jessica, but I put some things in there that were a bit of just like what I wish I would have had and things that I would have needed. So I have, KB and Granddaddy have conversations together that I wish an adult in my life would have had with me. And, because I could think about how those things would have impacted my understanding of like myself and my family and, things like race, right? Granddaddy has conversations with KB about race that are very candid at a very early age. She's 10 years old when these conversations happen, which is not early. We need to be having these conversations as early as possible just to, like normalize things and make sure that we're, modeling good behavior, because a thing I talk about too is just like sometimes kids will pick things up from us and it's not because of anything we've said, but it's maybe just how we act or how we interact with other people, and then they pick up on that, which some of the other characters, Bobby and Charlotte, friends that KB tries to make, help to kind of bring that point to life. So yeah, I think with these secondary characters, I wanted to use them to each aid in bits and pieces of KB's journey to like finding herself and figuring out, her family and those sorts of things. But, I could write a whole nother book about Nia, right? From Nia's perspective of not even of the same summer or of something completely different, because, I think each of these characters has a very rich perspective on what's going on around them.
Yeah, that modeling, Jessica, I think of Sheba. There's so many, Mary Jane learns from so many of the characters in the Cone family and Sheba and Jimmy, but like Sheba to me was like, she really connected with Mary Jane. I don't know if you saw that the same way.
Yeah, no, she's seeing different versions of womanhood. Like you don't have to be a housewife. Like it's 1975 and she's in a sort of conservative neighborhood. You don't have to be a housewife or a teacher, which would be the only women she would see. You can be sexy, and you can be, and even Mrs. Cone, who rejects her traditional roles. So she's seeing different versions of womanhood and sort of figuring those out. And then even with the guys, with Jimmy, it's like she's seeing men who don't put on a suit and leave the house every day, and men who cry. Jimmy cries in front of her, and she, like, that would seem impossible to her at the time. So it's a lot of Yeah, I mean, I think as we're saying, there's a lot of working out our own childhood and working out our wish fulfillment and working out our past relationship. There's a lot of working out our own stuff in these proxies for ourselves, and I'm happy to see somebody else does that as well.
Yeah.
Appreciate that, and I can't wait to read your book. Hi, thanks.
Yes, same. Thank you.
Allegra, for Sam, she again has many different characters, who are kind of showing her different ways of being. But I think what's really interesting about your book is there's a character kind of later in the book, her boyfriend's great-grandmother.
Great-grandmother in her 90s.
Yes, she kind of appears late, but becomes this like amazing, I don't know, friend to her or
Sort of
mentor.
a friend.
I don't know. How would you describe it?
There's this character named Anne who is Sam's boyfriend. Sam's boyfriend lives with his great-grandmother. He helps her out. He can't afford to live by himself. He's like a gardener, like a part-time gardener. And he lives in this old house with his great-grandmother, and she's salty, and she's tough. But she's sort of a very different kind of maternal presence for Sam, somebody she's never experienced before, with a lot of different perspective also, coming from her generation, which isn't even Sam's mother's generation or even Sam's grandmother's generation, but her great-grandparents' generation. And I would say that she is a real influence on Sam and the boyfriend as well. I'm very interested in sort of multi-generational relationships. That Kai talked about the grandfather and the young girl. I'm very interested in that stuff as well. As you say, that these people don't live in a vacuum.
I've hardly left enough time for questions here, so let me jump in with a question from the audience. So would it be true to say that a coming of age story is not limited to a certain age? You've all written adult stories with young narrative voices and talked about how genres overlap. Do you think the age definition is more blurry now because of cultural complexities?
Yeah, I could see like a Mormon wife leaving, you could see anybody when their world changes from what they thought it was into something new, that it would be a coming of age no matter how old the person was.
I totally agree.
Yeah, and all of your characters are, Sam, obviously we've said spans a wide age range, but they're all a range of ages here today. Let's see, we also have, do you have to consciously be careful not to make your young characters too perceptive? Kai, we talked a little bit about that for you, that KB.
Oh, yeah.
But
yeah, I think you have to think about like your character, what makes sense for them to know and not know, right? So KB's 10, so there's some things that age-wise I'm like, maybe she wouldn't know, but she's very perceptive. She reads a lot, right? So she's able to have different kinds of wisdom, but also she's naive in certain ways. So I think it's more about defining your character, and then you've created a context for what types of things they would be perceptive about and what types of things they wouldn't even notice.
Allegra, I think one thing you do so well in your book is that really close third person kind of gradually ages, that narrative voice.
Interested in showing how she gets more sophisticated as she gets older. It's also that she wouldn't even have the words. She wouldn't even know some of the words to explain what she's going through when she's like 7, 8 years old. But at 17, she's much more sophisticated, and the whole voice of the book changes as she grows.
Yeah, it's really well done. Let's see, one last one for now. If anyone has any others, throw them in there quick. Are you each willing to talk about what you're working on next or now? You don't have to. I know it can be. Well, some people like to, some people don't like to.
I'm writing a screenplay that I have to finish because the writer's strike starts Monday at midnight. So I have
That's like tomorrow.
Yeah, I know. That's my wrists. I'm like just doing it. My wrists are sore. So I'm working on that.
I'm working on another. Oh, go ahead.
No, I do want to hear what you two are working on.
I'm working on a few different projects, but a young adult novel centering a 15-year-old's perspective, kind of at the emergence of the Black Lives Matter.
Ooh, that's nice. It's interesting how quickly things become history, right?
Yeah.
It's so recent. I have a new book coming out supposedly in 2025. um, and I it's totally different from Sam, and I wrote most of it while I was writing Sam, which is was interesting. But it's very different. It has some thematic things in common. It also has a young woman in it who is also tested, but apart from that, very, very different circumstances and person. I'm excited about it.
Awesome.
What's the
Also,
title? Can we get the title?
Still working on the title.
Okay. I don't know if Kai's still does
Stay
it. Kai,
tuned.
if we can get Kai's title too, I like filing titles in my head.
Yes.
Speaking of titles, I guess we have time maybe for one last question. We've got a couple minutes left. Let's talk about titles. Because I think it's really interesting that, you know, we have two books that are the main characters. Like, how did you decide on your title? What was like, you know, I guess for Sam, maybe it just seemed obvious. I'm not sure.
Well, I kept trying. I thought Sam was my working title, but I thought it was like too simple and too short. And like, but every time I tried to come up with a different title, it would sound pretentious. And it was like the book kind of resisted it. Like that wasn't, you know, the book is her, that she just embodies it. So it had to be Sam.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you feel the same way about Mary Jane?
Yeah, and I love the name Mary Jane. I love the sound of it, and I like that it sort of references marijuana in a way. I mean, I just love the sound of it. But I do have a theory about it, because in listing great books with the title, the word bone in it, I have a theory that if you put the word bone in your title, it'll be a bestseller. So just somehow you just have to work the word bones or bone in there, and then it's a hit.
I think for a while it was the same with, like, you just called it like the clockmaker's daughter or whatever, like make it
Something's
somebody's
daughter or somebody's wife.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kai, tell us what your title means to you. And
It came from me thinking about one of the scenes in the book. That was one of the earliest scenes I wrote, which is when KB is learning to catch fireflies. That scene was special to me because it reminded me of the times that I spent in Lansing doing similar things. So I wanted to title the book kind of based on that theme, or with that sort of, you know, firefly imagery. And then I kind of just paired that with this idea of like knowledge, and Tabasco is stressed out because my family is coming home and he thinks that they're intruders, but turns out it's just my kids. My daughter's out the door saying, "Listen to my voice, it's me." Anyway, so I wanted to pair that with this notion of thinking about like secrets and truth and knowledge, which I feel like is like very key to the book itself. And so I don't remember how I came up with What the Fireflies Knew specifically, but at some point that's what I landed on, and I don't know, threw it in the Twitter poll to see if people liked it.
oh, really?
Yeah.
Was there
I was so
competitive
unsure, and I had
title, or
all
was
these
it-
ideas, and I was just like, let's just take it to Twitter and see what people think.
I love
so that was
that.
super helpful.
and people liked it on Twitter? Nice. Well, I love that. I want to thank you all for sharing your stories with us. And thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you for having
Yes,
us.
thank you.
Thank you so much.
I
It was lovely to
too.
talk to both of you. I can't wait to read your next book.
I too want to thank you all for being here. This was a great conversation. Thanks so much, Hannah, for moderating. And I hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Appreciate it.